Hello everyone, today we talk about the Carolingian Empire, Louis the Pious, his successors, and the new political system that fundamentally starts substantiating, concretizing in the 9th century, especially as far as the later subdivision of the empire into the various regional chunks that would in fact stay like kingdoms, like on their own, within the entire empire that, as you know, was never really over. We made lots of videos about the Carolingians, so I don't think there is any need to introduce the historical context and more. I wish I had made actually more content on the Carolingians and somehow more evenementally based, given that the history of the family, especially in one of the various repartitions, is a lot of stuff, like politically and militarily. We will make other videos soon about Carolingian warfare, for example, but it's like a universe on its own. For a period that, after all, is quite archaic, not overwhelmingly documented, but still quite crucial, as you know, for the development of modern Europe, and especially of that Western world, narrowly meant that sort of expanded to incorporate other parts of Europe during Carolingian times, but also and ever more later on during the centuries. So I will not make again too much philosophy about the latter aspect. I made plenty of videos on the topic. Some are old, but we will surely come back on them soon in a more detailed and sort of specialized fashion. I made a video specifically that can be useful as an introduction regarding Charlemagne's precepts to Louis the Pious during in view of his succession. Charlemagne, as you know, died in 814, and he had already been dealing up to that point since 806 with the problem of succession that was a bit like the vexata question in Frankish history, in which you know perfectly well that the Franks didn't really have any other way of seeing the empire, the regnum, the public, but in a private way, right? There is a private nature of Frankish public culture, even among the Carolingians, that are the ones that are credited for like a greater attempt to statalize, right? An attempt that ultimately failed and that had the same empire collapsing in the process. But that still left some important legacy, to say the least, that we're not going to analyze, but that was connected, in fact, with this dynastic principle that all the sons were expecting to inherit equally. The thing being complicated by the fact that traditionally the Frankish king had a right, in an otherwise monogamic society, to multiple concubines, the children of which were, in this sense, comparticipating to the to the expectations of the legitimate children. Charles the Bald being actually the most famous example of that. Naturally, everything is to be understood down the line of the various assets that even the royal marriages and or again affairs entailed in the court politically. The fact that, of course, the same Carolingian rulers were aware of this ferocious mechanism. If we are looking at a Carolingian as something like the Carolingian Empire, it's essentially because Charlemagne and Louis the Pious that were, in this sense, also the more enlightened of the Carolingian rulers as far as the idea of a public authority, the church reformation, various reforms, as you know, in scripts, in general administration, were a product of the fact that these had remained the only sons, like the only surviving sons that would have not had them to split power with anyone. As you know, Charlemagne had quite a problem with his brother Charlemagne before the latter died, right? And so he became sole ruler. The same was with Louis the Pious, that had other, many other siblings. And so the thing is enormously complicated. It can help, as we've often reiterated, to approach what probably the Frankish mentality was at this point. Again, a private understanding of public culture, or to make it simpler, like no trace of public culture at all, if not in a sense of self-aggrandizement as far as the individual ruler was concerned. Again, in a world that admittedly did not have that level of power concentration, of institutional stability. Like, the entire system had been molded through military clienteles, land owning. That was basically all what the Franks understood: swords, horses, and land, right? I made also a video explaining like the engineering of what we call like the Carolingian cavalry from the times of Charles Martel. It's a longer story, as you know, but it's important because from this primitive brutality that, however, was truly energetic and positive, intentionally speaking, and truly the empire shows it. Like, Charlemagne was really, like, not just, for example, a logistical talent and a warrior of clear fame, to say the least, but he understood like the importance of the cooperation with the church, like between the regnum and the sacerdotium, the importance of Romanity, the necessity of more permanent, stable public foundations to the empire. This is crucial in a time like, the Roman Empire in the West had not had been existing up to 3 centuries before. We're talking about incredibly early times. What the Carolingians achieved is objectively striking at so many levels. All right. The criteria of the divisio regni, just to come back to the point of the inheritance, the succession, were the same ones of the Frankish Salian tradition that, as you know, would make also, because of the same Frankish legacy, that great part of royal legal tradition, right, as far as inheritance was concerned in later centuries. So the thing had proceeded from Charlemagne to Louis the Pious, say, before that, in this fashion, because again, there were other children. So the idea was that one part would have been given to each of the 3 sons of Hildegard, right, one of the many wives, actually, of Charlemagne. To Charles was assigned Aquitaine, to Pippin, Italy and Bavaria, and to Louis, the territorial heart of the empire. This had occurred when Charlemagne was still alive, right? The great favored was Pippin. That was really like the best of the 3. Louis was the name, was a variant, as you know, of one of the first Frankish king, Clovis. That's basically where it derives from, and he would be crowned in Aachen, so the second Rome, right? This city of stone, like a citadel, like there were a set of palaces, otherwise like center that wouldn't expand more than much, but still in Carolingian times really embodied that imperial grandeur at so many levels. If you ever visit Aachen, like the cathedral, the throne of Charlemagne, like it's a beautiful experience to witness, especially for a medieval. Well, he was crowned there in 813, Louis, to grant also tranquil, say a smooth passage, transition after the precocious death of his brothers, right? Pippin died in 810, right? He was like very much like his father, like a very energetic, military-minded guy. He died of malaria at the siege of Venice. All right, Venetian lagoons. You can imagine that the context might try to essentially to strip this territory from what was essentially Byzantine control, but also more concretely a precociously developing Venetian power that would remain, in fact, in between at some point, like the Western and Eastern Empire, that they had dealings with the same Carolingians and so on. There had been other, say, military activities to which Pippin had participated, for example, the ones that were triggered by the reopening of the Beneventan succession in the Langobardia Minor in southern Italy. For the aforementioned, again, expeditions against Venice that were not actually getting anywhere territorially speaking, but they were very important in defining the relations with Constantinople that still had an important control in some parts, at least, of the peninsula, and or was capable to act through proxy wars and so on. So Italy was so important, as we'll see now, because of Rome, and for the same imperial title attached, as we will see, not just to the fact that, again, the emperor was crowned by the popes, which not yet had sort of kicked in. It would be under Louis the Pius that the thing was confirmed, but the fact that eventually the kingship of Italy was connected was the prerequisite for the Roman crowning. So, in the sign of continuity with the father, Pippin, and the previous domination, there was the appearance, briefly, of the new king of Italy, Bernard, right? He was literally qualified as Rex Langobardorum, a title that, of course, indicated this Italian, dominion that he was provided with, and that, as you know, was connected with the replica of the same Frankish crown. I mean, Charlemagne, when conquering the Longobard kingdom, which is the exception for all the other lands that the Franks conquered, essentially maintained the Longobard crown. Right, it's as if he was literally both king of the Franks and king of the Longobards, so putting them at the same level. Eventually, the kingdom was renamed the Kingdom of Italy, the Italic Kingdom, to erase a bit that memory of Longobardness, because the idea was, let's smoothen, say, the differences as much as possible. But this is essentially what will make the same. While the Frankish kingdom factually ends, at least it gets split in two, like the Italic one will remain straight, like one piece from the time of the Longobards themselves. So the very young Bernard, the very young sovereign Bernard, soon swore fealty, right, to the new emperor, his uncle Louis, at the death of Charlemagne. And in fact, in the first period, he sort of acted as imperial vicar of the major Frankish power that, as you know, was north of the Alps, and that this would also help dealing with the bishops of Rome, right? But in 817, Bernard would promote an uprising against his uncle, the Emperor Louis, with also a significant support of the Italic bishops and counts. This was a struggle within properly the Carolingian world, right? And I made a video about the first years, in fact, of Louis the Pius government. I will post it in the top fixed comment down below. And so I deal with that in detail. It's a pretty crude story, right? Because even before Louis marched on with his army into Italy, Bernard literally handed himself over to the emperor, hoping in the same clemency that Charlemagne had demonstrated in the past with other rebels. Think about the Saxon Widukind or others. At this point, instead, his uncle took him literally out, the typical Carolingian way, right? The typical Frankish way, like because of the sacred blood of the dynasty that since Merovingian times had brought to essentially the same family killing one another, like literally breaking children's heads on rocks. Like the Franks are the only people who do this because of their heavily, radically, traumatically, and violently dynastic essence and purity and Catholic imperial nature of their own power, right, of their own family, of their own blood. This is something, again, is extremely old. It's extremely rooted in their culture. That's how they do. They have to take these guys out. They do not quite do it under sunlight. They essentially blinded them, because if you were not physically fit, you would automatically be discarded from any kind of command, of authority. They were closed into. In fact, Bernard was closed into a monastery, where they died shortly afterwards. And the difference, whether he actually died as a consequence of this brutal blinding and the shock, the trauma, or where he was literally put down scientifically and voluntarily by his uncle's orders, is irrelevant, because it's literally the same thing. I mean, admittedly, the Byzantines did the same things, other peoples did the same things, but for the Franks, it was incredibly important from a strictly dynastic point of view. Right? Louis didn't want problems. Again, I dealt with all the political gaming of this uprising in that video. I told you, so we will probably come back on it, but this is just like for today's remembrance. And notice there the famous appellation Louis the Pious, right? Given, that is not to say he was actually not a pious ruler. He was actually a hell of a ruler in many ways, so not making the sort of passive-aggressive, hypocritical, oh my god, he blinded his nephew. There are all very sound, iron, logical, political reasons behind this, and they weren't even matters of option to some extent. So the pious, however, this is what I wanted to point out, is that as an attribute, as a nickname, much later to the death of the same Louis, right? That's how we came to call him later, and the reason in part being that in that same time he had been blamed for what he had done, and brought by, in fact, the clergyman in his court and in the last years of his life to repeated acts of penance. Right? It's a bit like Henry II with Thomas Becket and Similia. And so this is the reason why the concept came about. With the end of Bernard, there was another phase opening, especially as far as the void left properly in the void, or in the intermittence, say better, of the power within the Kingdom of Italy that would start leaving space to autonomous initiatives, to some counts and bishops. I made a video especially about 9th century Italian, in fact, clerical power, like the autonomization of major bishops, etc. It's a very important dynamic also for the later Ottonian times, and we will at some point observe also the lay side of the story, because that's also very interesting. So this is the Bernard's episode is the first instance of a Carolingian rebelling against his own emperor, so literally also a relative of his, which was tragically concluded by 818, and that had been triggered in great part by the resistance to the new sort of asset, the new frame or orientation of the empire that had shortly been prefigured by the same Louis in the beginning of his reign. In 817, you have the, in fact, Ordinatio Imperii, in which the emperor had contemplated that at his own death, the emperor would have been split among his 3 children, right? And these are sort of the most famous ones because they ended up inheriting for real. We all know them. The first is the namesake Louis, to whom the eastern territories would be counted. We know him for this reason as Louis the German historiographically. Pippin the south, well actually Pippin wouldn't make it, but he had initially like the southwestern territories, and the point was though that so it was a tripartite separation, but the idea is that the third one must have not just another realm of regional relevance, but would also have to inherit the imperial authority, because the empire could not be simply split, and or preferably there had to be, in spite of this pressing necessity of splitting in more or less equal chunks among the sons, like somebody who was the emperor would maintain that uniquely, right, as a unitary power, not cooperating hopefully with his brothers, which again, given the past experiences, was just seen as a bit of a wishful thinking. And in fact, the most important and central regions would go to the firstborn son, Lothar, right? This is what will later on, and not because of him, but because of Lothar II, give rise to the Lotharingia, because this territory was essentially containing the 2 capitals, Rome and Aachen. So it was this strip that went essentially from the Alps in the north towards the North Sea, and then Italy, right? And the latter was connected with the imperial authority, so that Lothar would in fact rule from Italy. This is as emperor of the whole system, and this is particularly important because if the actual center of Frankish powers, was more or less today's northeastern France, Benelux, and part of Western Germany. The actual center laying mostly in Austria. That was the point. Actually, this northern territory in the center was somehow a compromise to maintain a tiny bit of that sort of core of the Carolingian military clientele bases, but mostly, right? And so this corridor also controlling the Alpine passes and Italy, with the proximity to Rome, the rule from the Palatium of Pavia, and so in a more civilized, like urbanized part of the empire. And this had, say, nothing, say national predisposition like to this kind of divisions. Like the empire was so big and it had been ruled unitarily for so long that the idea was, okay, just I will functionalize the control of this chunk from here, and eventually everything came to fall apart just for other reasons that are ingrained in the vassalitic beneficiary system, in part also in these partitions, etc. But that you can't quite see immediately things like France, Germany, or Italy into this, right? It wasn't, for example, in the case of this Italian primacy, like something like an Italian party, right? There is, on the contrary, overall, like some sort of violent, say, manifestation of contrasts. In this case, when the empire again was still seen united after the first generation, after these 2 great unitary sovereigns, and Louis the Pious actually was still alive when his children, as you know, began to rebel against him and take over their parts. Between, say, different notions of what the empire had to be, this is a radically important topic that gets often overlooked. The fact that not just, say, the European continental borders were not to be extreme, like, so that fixed as the modern nations were habituated to sort of overlap with, which, yes, did have some sort of logic also in the different ethnic, linguistic, cultural divides of this, but rather also in the concerning the necessity of continuing the empire or not, right? The romanity of it, the fact that this was a huge thing. How would the clienteles be reorganized on this basis? It's a lot of stuff, and that's why we have to come back on that prepotently, because understanding that in many ways it's understanding the core of Carolingian politics, why it failed in at least in the unitary empire, but still maintained as a legacy in fact the existence of the empire in that traditionally transcendental way. It was to be owned, to take control by one of these elements, right? And this is like the most interesting thing in my opinion. So the most listened to intellectuals in the court of Louis the Pious, and in particular the monk Benedict of Aniane. This was a Goth from Septimania who was also nicknamed the Second Benedict. This guy had made a video about Benedict of Aniane. He had participated to the military expedition of Charlemagne in the siege of Pavia, 774. He had apparently fallen into the Ticino River in that occasion, and he had made a vow to God. If he had survived, he would have really dedicated himself to a monastic lifestyle. He was a great reformer across Gaul, and the greatest promoter of probably the ecclesiastical reorganization, reformation, uniformation that was carried out under Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, and that left one of the single greatest unitary marks in the history of Europe, right? These I also made a video on the court of Charlemagne specifically, and sort of what kind of parties, what forces agitated themselves from an intellectual point of view. But it's obvious that these clergymen would mostly suggest a theocratic orientation of the empire, with the accentuation, of course, of the Christian but also sacred aspects of imperial power. This was very appealing to the same rulers because it preserved a level of personal genetic dominance connected with a ruling family, but also in its sacredness would allow privileged connection with the church that was the only instrument that objectively the Franks had at their disposal to try to centralize this otherwise very decentralized empire to an extent that can be seen in the massive donations and prerogatives and privileges that were granted to the church in Carolingian times, that also helped dramatically preserving European civilization in the following centuries, as far as from the monasteries to think about the role of the bishops, also taking over the political, the military direction of their diocese during the second invasions, rebuilding in many ways the empire from scratch, almost from scratch after it had collapsed. These were in fact some of the strongest pillars that had remained standing. There was also another advantage into this, that is the ever greater difficulty within the institutional system to distinguish from lay to ecclesiastical power. There were many Carolingians themselves, people of Carolingian blood, who were powerful abbots, clergymen, and they also had a pretty lay lifestyle. Think about Nithard, right? Who tells us, because he had participated into it, about the Battle of Fontenoy, the largest Carolingian warfare, and that was killed at some point against the Vikings in Aquitaine, and that was literally just an abbot. He theoretically was just to live that life, but it just meant to have a essentially a revenue from that abbatial title, and pretty much it. At the same time, you have another aspect that is the instance of for the autonomization of the church more from the state. Let's say lay power in this case, as we have seen in the investiture controversy. We will talk in a while about the Constitutio Romana, because the same old problem had been going on since Constantine onward. The same investiture controversy was sort of alive at this point. Who did appoint the bishops? In theory, of course, it was the same church, right? But the lay interference in this was very strong. The same control of the papacy was sought after at this point. In the 9th century, you have actually a lot of contradictions of fuss about this, very often also implicitly, and depending on the still sort of unstable institutional profile of the empire in its wall, among all this fragmentation, sort of repartitions, successions, and so on. The ideal that would be propagated, as we've seen in Gregorian times, of the superiority of the sacerdotium over the regnum as an intrinsic power had already been a Gelasian thought. We're talking about a pope from the end of the 5th century, right? Rome had always been overwhelmingly self-aware about the radical spiritual power that had been exercising since those very times all over the Western world, and ever more at this point when probably a newly appointed Roman emperor had contributed to the affirmation of Christendom, conquering, converting, also forcibly, and new peoples across the frontiers. So there were lots of advantages from both sides, but the most famous expression of this reflection, dating from the first phase of Louis the Pious reign, were two fundamental acts conceived within the same court of the Carolingian sovereign. That is, the aforementioned Constitutio Romana, that in 824 intended to clarify the papal position as the one of the Roman bishop being owed to literally an oath of fealty to the emperor before his own consecration. Right? You understand also where the Gregorian reforms sort of came from. Ideally, this is also the time in history in which the Byzantines say, look, we have lost Rome. Right? This is literally the moment in which they say, up to this point, more or less, there had been a sort of commixtion, there were relations, Rome as a city had been politically free and or living in this sort of frontier, right? But at this point, they say, okay, this is, the Carolingians have it, right? And in fact, at this point, the Franks have a very strong hold on Rome, the city, and so that's the way Louis could issue such a thing, because otherwise the Pope would autonomize himself very much. It made a video about Rome at the time of Charles III, that, as you know, is the last proper Carolingian, at least in a narrow sense, on the throne as an emperor of the whole system, and in what the situation in just a couple of generations had turned out to be. Like the Roman factions were just flirting either with the Eastern or the Western Franks for maintaining their own power, that were the Byzantines on the other side. The same Carolingian Empire had been weakening in its internal structure. The other thing is the admonitio ad omnes regni ordines, that in 825 instead framed the bishops within the active supporters of the sovereign, because they had been entrusted with the missaticum. You know who the missi dominici were, right? The idea that the sacerdotium and the regnum had to be cooperating also as sort of this couple of agents that had to be sent ruling in every county. Like there was a bishop in the diocese and the count ruling the district. This is like the ABC of the High Middle Ages in Europe, and they sort of date to they don't date to this point, but the way they are organized, because they had always existed, whether it was the counts and the bishops, the dukes or the bishops. The important was the connection now, not even with the king, but with an emperor, with the idea that there is an ultimate universal power, as much as the one of the Roman Church, and that even though, as we've seen, the emperor can appoint de facto even the pope that is owed to obedience to him, also he very much needs the support of these guys, that just like the counts that will sort of disgregate the empire themselves, because after overextended they couldn't get the loot from anywhere else, but sort of started autonomizing and making the thing falling apart. Equally, the clergy had the centralized position, and as we were pointing out before, there are many instances of, in fact, conflation of lay and spiritual power that would always overlap also, as you understand. And in fact, much of the struggle was literally about what is superior to one another. Like, of course, the emperors were trying to compenetrate the two things by saying, okay, but I sort of, as an autocrat, sum up the both of them, like the Byzantine Sebastocratores. Well, the Christian tradition in the West had a bit, again, a greater self-awareness and sort of an autonomy, an autonomous tradition for fully accepting that. And so even if these the Constitutio Romana, as you know, was boasted by the emperors during the investiture controversy all over, because they said, look, this happened at some point. It's just like the popes would provide with the Donatio Constantini, and not only, but these weren't the only prerogatives. There was an enormous theological and politological, legal, juridical inquirement, But you understand that the commixtion had began at this point. And you consider that in these years, the term ecclesia means essentially, say, the Christendom as a body, at the same time religious and political, right? There is not yet the full distinction even in this Frankish mentality between the lay and the temporal power, right? And it sort of makes sense to a degree, because they understood, of course, what the factual difference was, but in terms of compenetration, the fact that still the church was run by essentially the same people as bishops coming from the nobiliar families and sort of having had the same lifestyle in many ways, will produce this. And with that lack of sort of public culture, like this sort of ambiguity, naturally in different parts of the empire things were felt differently. So within this attention for the relations between royal and ecclesiastical structures, we have to frame the prescriptions or a more rigorous observance of the Benedictine monastic rule. This was very important, because the monasteries especially had this enormous role of connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe, culturally, in script, in just even to an extent of diplomatical, like social connection. Benedict of Agnan exhorted to spread the reform, of course, in all the monasteries of the empire, right? Some areas, as I was saying before, were different from one another. It's obvious that, Rome and the surroundings were historically sort of much more aware of what the church was, also administratively, politically, whatever. We know that before the Carolingian reconquest, say, in 8th century Bavaria, like, the priests barely could read Latin, right? It was the fact that, in fact, they were so distant from any sort of real, say, theological understanding that this would prevent from heresies to spread, because it was also not a reason at the time for that, right? And there were lands that had been recently Christianized. Think about Saxony. Other areas of the empire had sort of barely been Christian, at least in the consistency of the actual beliefs. Like not because they were opposed to Christianity, but literally because the level of understanding of the same in the masses, especially probably the Frankish world, that were very, very subjected to a sort of a few people that controlled all the power, was extremely superficial. Anyway, from a social cultural point of view, a lot does change under Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. You have the Synod of Aachen in 816, in which matters pertaining to the reform of canonical life of the episcopal chapters are discussed. And to this, the bishops had to participate to avoid an excessive, let's say, in fact, mingling with mundane questions. Right? This is not the video to explain again what probably the episcopal lifestyle at this point really was, but again, it was very, very close to the lay one still. There was this lack of control and discipline and hierarchy and so on, because again, that building, like especially north of the Alps, had not yet been established. It was in some areas barely forming now. Like Gaul was very, again, Christian, Roman to an extent, but even within it, like the north was very, in fact, the center of Frankish power was very different from Occitania, as you know, and so this is all something that affects the development. The same subdivisions were partitions of the empire. Now, the second phase of the reign of Louis the Pious, whose death occurred in 840, was particularly, as you know, tormented because of the conflicts with his sons and their clienteles, because that's also how it worked. Like a guy was given, like, I don't know, Eastern France, okay. There was a bunch of people literally moved at the moment under his control, like to be rewarded as military, like as faithful and like being invested with further land, especially newly conquered parts, and so everything did work even too easily in that regard. And the matters of succession in this sense were extremely relevant, because from a moment to another you would have had probably to change country according to how the direction from which the wind blew. And at this point you have actually a shrinking of that, because of the let's say before Charlemagne's time you would cross this enormous territory all usually because of the various military campaigns, right? Either conquering some new people or beating him afterwards during the rebellions, and crushing this revolt or another. There was always something to do, and you would always be on the move. At this point was also settling some bases that would be, well, were not yet to be seen as permanent, because the Louis' children still, of course, wanted to imagine themselves at the head of the entire empire. And again, Charles III will later have succeed in, but shortly, to say the least, doing so. But there was also another issue. It was not just the three aforementioned children. There was also the birth from the second wife of Louis the Pious of a fourth male heir, Charles, whose mother was really a hell of a lady. She really engineered this, and she succeeded. The rise of her son to an unprecedented power. In fact, the same name Charles was very programmatic, right? Charles the Bald, that was to be called as his grandfather. So unlike his brothers, and so this had to say he's actually the one. This was quite an issue, because it sort of put newly in discussion the criteria of the Ordinatio Imperii of 817, which the empire had already been preemptively split, in the testament of Louis, as soon as he had come to power practically. He would die only 23 years later, but still, the life of a Frankish ruler was that sort of full of unknowns, let's put it in this way. And in fact, the wars that broke out at this point because of these issues were so big in scale that Louis was twice deposed and reintegrated. But it was also about the tradition, the practical level of, say, the theoretical elaboration of new counselors, for example, that were not really interested in the unity of the empire per se, right? They all wanted, like, as down the line that, say, the vassals were starting to autonomize themselves, so the bigger chunks were saying, but why should we even continue with this thing? Like, why is it so relevant after all? This does fit like the problem of, again, of the West in some ways. Like, once you get to the top, you must have some deeper awareness of what you have achieved in order to maintain the thing. Like, the saying second invasions were not just a product of some peoples that randomly activated themselves for no reason. Surprise, surprise, all at a time. What was happening? It was the Carolingian Empire. We even called them into itself, and that we sort of, began to think it was, oh my God, these people were so dangerous and whatever. The enormous, say, Frankish power and potential had always remained there, would always remain there. And even more later, like in just a bit more than a century, like there is, as we were talking about the other day, just like about the countryside reboomed dramatically, and even more strong, because now it had absorbed part of the lesson. It had begun to rebuild, like from properly the foundations, in a much more effective way. There were many families, powerful families, that were discontent of the situation, because again, the great phase of conquests had ended by this point. And the Franks had succeeded in conquering this immense empire because of the continuous occasions of career and property that the continuous expansion could really keep fueling, right? And so they began to redirect internally their own energies. They began to consider the patrimonialization of some beneficiary lands and public functions that had been entrusted to them just by the public authority by name, but through this sort of prepaid system for which I just entrench you there, and I don't even have the means of dislodging you from it. As long as you remain loyal, because again, there is more to conquer, more to get. So as long as that, attracts, like you will stay with me. But after that, right, that happens, differently. What this system was kept together with this was this Romano-Germanic, say, political, administrative, spiritual, sort of cultural idea of grandeur, of course, of Catholic. Imperial, let's say, belief, like the real, the romanity of the empire, the reactivation of it through the auspices of this fresher race that had managed to redeem in part the same Roman sins by also, like, in fact, reintegrating the true romanity within the empire. So this is interesting. Like, the thing would not disgregate to back to some previous time. Nobody really thought that would have been good, right? It's not that Saxony was so brutally conquered and forced into conversion and whatever, and so everybody hated this damned Christian Franks. Like, what happened when the empire crumbled? Like, the Saxons are fully Christian. They actually become the ones that bear the empire themselves. And there is no coming back to that, right? There is a lot of social engineering, admittedly, occurring with the affirmation of an elite through the Carolingian model. This is true pretty much everywhere that had been, as we've seen, the more powerful mover of the system. And this is how, in fact, the various vassalitic clienteles in the various kingdoms, the various partitions of the empire, put themselves at the service of the local princes, of the local Carolingian offspring, right? This is how, in fact, as we will see in a while, the various kingdoms, the post-Carolingian kingdoms, emerged as still part of an empire. Remember, the empire is not an administrative concept; it's a spiritual one, it's a universal one, it's a metaphysical one, right? Sacerdotium and imperium are written in the stars, not in the dirt, right, of Earth. So it's obvious that the collapse of what we call the Carolingian Empire, of course, followed the tendency, in fact, to the localization, to the fragmentation, to the same dirt, in fact. But this was occurring because of this previous imbalance, like the major offshoot, and then like sort of the coming, say, the short, of long-term expectation, the softening up, the sort of relaxation. This rooting of power was not just a lay thing, by the way. Also, bishops and other title holders of ecclesiastical immunities had actually increased very fast. That's why I remember that video about 9th century Italy that explains it pretty well. There are ever fewer big landowners that are basically taking over many other communities that had traditionally been free and that now find themselves like sort of obliged to be under these guys, also because in times of war and invasions, etc., like it's sort of the best direction. This had always been the case in places like France. It started being very, very felt also in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, that is less stratified, but also because it had even less public culture than the Western Frankish land, sort of, makes it even easier for a private aristocratic power to affirm itself on the rest of the population. This shattered that otherwise, functional system had been the functionary net, for example, the capacity of the crown to contain probably the military threats of a plurality of institutional subjects. At that point, again, had been following the leader, right? Had been in tune with the system. So to face a similar situation, also the sovereign recurred with ever greater frequency with the basiletic beneficiary system. That, what we're talking about, like you're a vassal because I give you a benefit, and this is literally like the land that has to essentially produce like the necessary for a military retinue and the administration of justice, which sort of going parallel in many ways, because again the Franks are not particularly sensitive people, humanly speaking. They just know the language of the sword, and they know it better than anybody else. That's the only thing they know, but for this reason they are truly exceptional at it. It's because they spent their entire life doing this. Speaking of properly the elite, what will become, especially in the 10th century, the sort of homogeneous military class of Europe, Western post-Carolingian Europe, the milites, right? There would be so much to say. As you understand, here we're running, literally, but it's to get the essentials. Sometimes it's better even than the details, right? The weakening of royal power was felt also in Italy, where between 823 and 840, as we've seen before, Lothair, Emperor Lothair, had been ruling, but with so at least it was the core regency was really normal, especially in times of struggle with their father. These rulers had sort of made different deals, but again, the idea that Lothar was to be the one blessed with imperial authorities, would get it finally, was pretty clear, was entailed in the Ordinatio, again, of 870. Lothar was not always in Italy, by the way, for, as I understand, political and strategical reasons. It was its base anyway, because they were literally based into these various chunks, each by each, and so they tended to, they attempted at least to sort of put a break to all that series of emergencies that were highlighting the serious institutional crisis of the empire that, again, a couple of generations would have been no more, right? So you have actually a pretty intense issuing, for example, of capitularies. So this were the Carolingian laws for the various kingdoms, the entrusting of public offices only to people of very specific, like, background, right? Some of the, for example, from the very heart, like, of the northeastern sort of Frankish world, the finest noblemen were installed into the Italic kingdom to control the frontier areas, the more strategic Alpine passes, like the frontier with the Byzantines, because this had been to be first order noblemen that were way more reliable, like the sort of more adventurer style, like final rank Carolingian Frankish horsemen, right? There were also means to actually counter the high nobility with these newcomers, because also the nobility was not as stratified in Europe as it would be in the later centuries, so it was sort of easier to foster relations with this other parvenu. But still, there was a lot of, okay, like, if you have a lot of wealth, a lot of estates, yes, you're kind of dangerous, but if I manage to co-opt you, I can also control more through you, and you're sort of more backing with more power my own royal imperial authority, so that the system keeps on going, in terms of what we can get as a mutual benefit. In any case, again, the system does not really hold as a rule. There are some things, again, the empire never dies, public authority sort of remains, sometimes in a very feeble way, but still, right, for being renovated in the following centuries to an important degree. It's not the pre-Carolingian one at the same extent territorially, but still in a deeper spiritual, political way. So 3 important and famous episodes following the death of Louis the Pious clarify how the Carolingian domination had already been losing its politically unitary character. Think about this also in the life of these people, what it means, first of all, to be the offspring of Charlemagne, that your father had held the Roman Empire on behalf of the Roman papacy and of God, and if not directly from God, to some of these people's mindset. And ruling this enormous territory, you would have been traveling, you would have been know what this was about. Think about 9th century Europe, but breathing, feeling like the air, the earth, the water, the light of places like Germany, the Atlantic plains of Aquitaine, the Alps, the sun of Rome, or the primitive brutality of Frisia, for example. And so a feeling, by the way, the sort of the variety, like the might, the imposance of this empire must have been really exceptional. And in this world so plagued by violence and and instability and so on, even the idea of carving your own part of it and saying, okay, that I sort of like giving the gamble, I think, in terms of cost-benefit ratio, I'm satisfied with this. Or yes, I would like to have more myself, I'm the first one, because my blood is sacred and I belong to the super race that has conquered the world, is rejuvenating the system. I will still sort of give up a little bit of it because I want to see what happens and stabilize on this sort of more regional other than universal basis that I have, and that is also pretty difficult to administer as a whole, right? I made a video about, for example, the Eastern Frankish rule of Louis the German, which is, speaking in fact of like what areas of Germany were really central. The early power was concentrated in Bavaria, on the Danube, in Regensburg. Some other areas were so peripheral in many ways that weren't even visited that often by these rulers, right? So that's for way more in-depth videos, but we have fun with the essence and the detail on Schwerpunkt alternating. Here there is the other vexata question of the aforementioned identification of these specific geographical areas that would have been coincidentally provided with sort of more homogeneous, distinguishable cultural traits, right? So again, the idea that France, Germany, Italy, even part of, if you look at Lotharingia, at least the part of Benelux towards the North Sea, there's some stuff to that. There are also precocious other, I think about Alemannia in the sort of mostly, say, not just, but overlapping, even partly Swiss dimension. It's a big deal. It's not to say again that things would have had to evolve in that direction, but there is also some pattern over which that would be built, and it sort of exists at this point. It's important to understand, however, how exactly at this point that had come to be, at least what for Carolingian times this thing was handled because of course there are all the other videos I made also on Alemannia, Alpine Russia. There is a lot of stuff like from the historical regional series that you can go check out in the relative playlist. So the aristocracies are ruling them, first of all. These are essentially the Frankish aristocrats that the Carolingians have scattered all over as literally military colonists of some sort, like provincial rulers. In the case of the higher nobility, that checks all this territory that cooperate. There is a lot of cooptation. The Carolingians, for example, fostered the relation between these kingdoms by sending, when there was an army, they sent, there were some strategical or logistical facilitations by drawing people from the closer place where the front was, but there were, especially among the noblemen, some scare, some units were placed, going to fight in Saxony. You would have some Longoburg troops, or equally from sending the Saxons fighting, which they didn't understand really much, to places not even that far, like in the campaigns against the Avars or up to Spain. Actually, I made a video about some mercenaries in the early high medieval times, and the Saxons alone would actually do it for the Franks, but they didn't like when this was, of course, was imposed, even though they had no choice at that point, at Similia, right? You have this massive bloodbath probably during the Carolingian fratricide wars. The most important one is for sure the Battle of Fontenoy, the same date of my birthday. You always remember this was fought in 841 during essentially by the two children of Louis the Pious that were Louis, the future Louis, Louis the German, essentially, and Charles the Bald, that had finally surpassed his brother Pippin that had, their brother Pippin that had died in 838. There's all a story, a little kingdom had been carved, if I'm not wrong, in Provence or Burgundy, something like that, for Charles the Bald, then passed to Aquitaine, then he finally took over the Western Frankish kingdom, and even managed later on to be crowned as, emperor, as Charles II, even though he could not control the Italian crown, because the Germans had descended from the Alps, and there would have been a major showdown, even a bigger bath of blood than the Battle of Fontenoy in northern Italy, and it's that they sort of found an agreement, and they accepted that more or less everybody would come back where they had come from. So this is interesting because it tells you how, they wanted the whole chunk especially they wanted the imperial title. That was sort of the more expandable thing, but they were capable of giving up themselves one region, even such an important one, or maybe especially because of that, what it entailed. So that as long as the other wouldn't control it, because of even the lack of power by that point. And at Fontenoy, Louis and Charles defeat their other brother Lothair, which is also interesting because you have here the clienteles are very mixed and complicated, but you've seen you have essentially the west and the east of Francia against this sort of Italian plus some sort of other territory in the north. And again, it's incredibly complicated. There are many different treaties. There's not just the Dan. There is Mersen, for example. These are, we will see them in detail. I already made a video about the Carolingian empire, imperial repartitions, but the logic behind them are also quite interesting. But these territories will remain relatively unstable, depending on, let's say, the situation, especially at this point, because as you know, for example, Lotharingia would be finally incorporated in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, so they would be part of the Holy Roman Empire rather than France later. So there is an agreement that evidently had been established between the two younger brothers against their imperial sibling that was to be formalized in itself in the solemn oath of Strasbourg in 842, which is also very important because of the documentation. It sort of shows a bit like the differences linguistically, because they exchanged the tongue, like when swearing from one another, like one would sort of write this in the Eastern Frankish way, the other in the Western Frankish way. It's a very primitive way of saying sort of France and Germany, but very primitive way. And also because these Carolingian rulers didn't objectively give a damn about this difference. They were doing it mostly for the sake of their own side. But as you know, also in the West, the Carolingians would keep speaking. The Western Frankish court, Germanic, was spoken until well into the 10th century, even though the country spoke like a Romance language. So this was done before the respective armies, and this again sort of Romance language would be essentially an old French, and the this Proto-German one from the other, and this had to be done so that one king could be understood by the suspicious followers of the other. That is part of the issue, but these were also important because aside from the written statement, that everything was very oral at the time. There was a vocal culture. Voice was really like what a man spoke in front of God, and so there were so many deep implications in this difference. Like there's also a competition, like who's the strongest side. These are allies here, but they're also again quite distrustful of one another. In fact, again, they would later sort of fight again too. They threw Vikings at one another, for example, little cute exchange of favors between siblings. And this is also how the Norse had the chance of roaming continental Europe a bit in the process. You have here also obviously a separation of the political milieu, like the idea that the system had exhausted itself to the point that these two establishments wanted to recognize themselves like to some permanent degree, like separated between East and West, like has this linguistic equivalence. Then you have the more famous treaty of Verdun of 843 that finally assigned, because this included Lothair, to Louis, in fact, it at this point gets the name of the nickname of the German, right? So the reign east of the Rhine, so the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, in fact, and that's how it was called, because they considered it like Francia, even though there were some chunks, of course, that like only Austrasia in part what would become the Frankenland or other areas on the Rhine, it had been Frankish lands ethnically, historically, right? But then you had Saxony and you had Bavaria that, had been some sort of sub-Frankish creation. But there was Thuringia, there was also the Eastern Mark, was another thing. But I mean, this is enucleated as, okay, this is Frankish stuff, and you kind of get the Eastern part, right? And so Eastern Frankish. That's how it becomes. Then Charles the Bald notoriously got the western part, west of the Meuse, the Maas, the Saône, and the Rhône. The latter is also important because this wide intermediate territory that connected, again, the North Sea to the Kingdom of Italy, and the two capitals, Rome and Aachen, was entrusted to Lothair. That at this point, like, was fully recognized the imperial title, right? That had been actually the casus belli, like it's how the guy had claimed his title and triggering the same brothers for that, right? So this was a bloody compromise. Then there were various adjustments, like for example, Provence at some point was given properly to the Kingdom of Italy, and then you have again different boundaries shifting, especially in between, and later on, of course, after them, gradually the Eastern Franks would gain sort of a upper hand over the Lotharingian part. So the long reigns of Charles the Bald, especially, he outlived a little bit, but also Louis the Germans granted continuity, especially to these two chunks, like the Francia Occidentalis and the Francia Orientalis. Both the sovereign attempted to expand, to increase their own dominions, right? Charles, for example, carried out the usual reannexation of Aquitaine, that since Charles Martel had been brought under the Frankish heel, like it was a Merovingian thing back in the day, like Clovis had stripped the land from the Visigoths, but during the decline of the Merovingians, Aquitaine had autonomized itself a big deal, and literally Charles Martel awaited the Arabs to conquer Aquitaine to eventually face them at Tours, Poitiers, which is after which reincorporated, in fact, the entire Aquitaine. Right? That's how it happened. At first, the Moors crushed, then they took them over. That's the actually incredibly clever and successful exploit there, aside from, of course, the importance of the battle and the broader sort of Christian Islamic struggle. But the Franks didn't like quite, the Aquitanians, nor the feelings were reciprocated. So much so that Aquitaine, as we well know also from the other videos also about Capetian times, remained a sort of separated entity for a long time until the 13th century. Louis tried to occupy further lands in the east, which was sort of also another Carolingian priority. Like they had expanded so much along the Danube, and there were the Slavs that bothered the realm on the frontier. There was some interesting interplay before the arrival of the Magyars in the Pannonian Plain. There were the Bulgarians on the other side. And just the Eastern Frankish Kingdom was a bit more primitively violent, and so that there was and also more difficulties in keeping it together as a mostly as a territorial unity, because say the Western Franks would have a precocious disgregation, politically speaking, but internally, right? But at least Gaul was sort of Gaul. Like Germany had yet to be fully molded, right? It's in fact exactly at this time that the sense of a Teutonic realm and Nazio began to emerge in a political sense attached to the Eastern Frankish kingdom, because, and it's something you see mostly in the abbots of Reichenau, St. Gallen, like it's mostly a monastic, historiographical, ethnographical invention that, of course, overlaps in part with this territory that was more or less, again, the Germanic-speaking area. Like further east you had the Slavs, again the frontier was pretty blurred, but in the north you had the pagans, in the south you had the Alps. More or less it started defining itself, aside from the fact that of course the Germans would keep literally colonizing and expanding further east, and since this point, right, not just the more famous, more punching sort of late medieval times one. Of all of course, there was an attempt by Louis to invade the Western Frankish kingdom, right? We've seen it in the video about his reign. He didn't succeed, but they managed to arrive up to Aquitaine. I mean, it was a pretty heavy blow, showing that Charles the Bald's power was also not that overwhelmingly stable. And again, the country was mostly falling apart because of the reasons why all these were falling, others were falling apart as well, with the autonomization of the local vassals. Of all the later territorial adjustments and annexations that characterized the years until the one before last decade of the 9th century, when in fact the Carolingian dynastic dominance terminated, we must remember the most important one. At the death of Lothar I in 855, the central realm, right, was dismembered among his children. That's how Lotharingia proper was born, because Lothar II received the part north of the Alps, that is Frisia, and that territory that in fact gets probably known as Lotharingia and Lorraine later, territories that would be, however, split once again at his death in 869 between Charles the Bald and Louis the German, so his uncles. But Lothar's name remained, right? Remember, it's not from Lothar I that Lotharingia comes about as a name, it's from Lothar II, because the guy had inherited literally mostly that part. I made multiple videos on Lotharingia. We'll have to come back on that also, as far as Lorraine, broadly speaking, is concerned. More narrowly speaking, is concerned. The firstborn Louis II, we're talking about Lothar's children, received instead Italy. That had already been entrusted to him sometimes, like the co-regency was very common among the Carolingians and other rulers, right? And together with Italy, of course, the imperial title, right? This is relevant because actually Louis II's reign is pretty cool. Like, they managed, like, everything was falling apart also in Italy, but they were sort of still managing to, for example, offend the Saracens in southern Italy, to strip them of Bari that had been otherwise a Byzantine, a Greek city. So the Constantinople is pretty triggered by that. There was a functional still like government, and capitularies issued, like infrastructural measures taken, and so on. It's just the imperial title in itself that is becoming ever more symbolical. Like, Louis II is just the king of Italy, let's be honest about this. Perhaps a bit of influence in Provence, yes, but that's pretty much it, right? The clienteles of the various Carolingian claimants to the royal primate could witness their own expansion ambitions partly satisfied by the definition and the widening of their own, say, spheres of domination within the territories. Again, society was sort of stratifying, partly even crystallizing because of the crisis. The seigneurial era kicks in as far as, say, people that had been free at some point, like, decide probably to hand over part of their liberty to be protected by this elite that is ever more proficient, militarily speaking, and as we've seen, rooting more at the local level, so their interests overlapped. Sometimes this happened also out of desperation. Think about the Stellinger revolt in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, when the freemen allied with the slaves, which was insane, like for a Germanic mentality, because they understood that the elites that the Carolingians had installed were so powerful they were crushing them. And you have, like, we will see this in different countries. We've seen this in other videos as well. There's a medieval society playlist. We didn't talk perhaps so much about the Carolingian era yet in that depth, but it's really a big topic. Mozalewski, for example, wrote about beautiful pages on this, pretty much for all the Germanic world at this point. This rooting at a local level was also incentivized by the same kings that, as we've seen, needed more, say, loyal clientele and more powerful clienteles at the same time within their own possessions. Also, the ecclesiastical personnel was carefully selected. The functionaries' careers took on an ever more local profile, both through that process of patrimonialization of the vassalatic beneficia, and for the literal, say, offices that could be entrusted to them. This went in parallel. The words sometimes basically the same thing, right? But there are differences between the, like, sometimes kings supported more the clergy, sometimes the laymen. We saw it better in the video about Louis the German. In the last, say, in the decade before the last, in the 19th century, you could have already seen enucleated those political areas constituted within the Carolingian Europe. That is to say, the two Francia, as we've seen, the Eastern and Frankish kingdom, the Italic kingdom. There was a sort of Provençal kingdom, like, that had sort of been enucleated as well. I made a video about the kingdoms of Burgundy throughout history, because they were at some point different things. There had been technically probably an Aquitanian one, but this was subsumed. Like, it always remained, like, just after this repartitions within the Western Frankish kingdom for good, like, aside from the autonomy of the local elite. We can speak of just a couple of sovereigns in this video that is already pretty long. The ones of Italy and of Western Francia, because they are useful to show the development, especially in the relation with the churches, particularly the one of Rome, but also the regional ones. Right, this was a very powerful element that accelerated the stabilization of regional political boundaries, as well as the threats posed by the external enemies that were essentially trying to devour this carcass. Right, the various chunks were sort of too big to swallow individually, and that would actually withstand these invasions. As you know pretty well, it would strengthen up once again, revive themselves over time. So Louis II, as we've seen, true and proper king of Italy, where he had been born and raised. He was crowned Rex Langobardorum in 844 by the same Pope, Sergius II. This is interesting because it shows how the regionalization of Italy entailed that the local crown, the royal crown, was also an object of, say, connection with the papacy in a way or another. This wouldn't be a long-standing tradition, right? The Pope would not crown the emperors kings of Italy, right? More than else, it was these that had to come to Rome to be crowned Roman emperors. But since Louis' reign, Louis the Pious reign, it had been made a condition that the Italic crown was the only one of all these necessary to be crowned also Holy Roman Emperor, right? It was not yet the term, but it's essentially the same thing. So it would remain later, right? Louis II himself had intervened to have his grandfather's Constitutio Romana respected for the consecration of the same Pope, Sergius II. And he first and foremost qualified his domination through an assiduous presence within the kingdom. Right? In many ways, there wasn't much of another option, because these regional boundaries had been stabilized, but internally, as we've seen, these realms were actually falling apart themselves, and Louis II's presence in Italy would belate much the effect, at least of many disgregative forts within the Italic kingdom. Louis II contrasted the royal vassals, such as the Marchians of Friuli and of Spoleto. I made a video for both provinces, by the way, including properly Friuli as just the history of the country, and Spoleto as the duchy, right? That is, it was a Lombard thing, but survived throughout the centuries until the 13th. And these were frontier areas, right, that had managed to strengthen themselves locally, right? This had been the case also during the Lombard kingdom. The Friulans had been actually pretty obedient to the kings, because their strategic goal of protecting the kingdom from the east, from the Avars, from the Slavs, had overlapped, right? Spoleto instead had historically been the rebellious duchy, never even dreaming to threaten the unity of the Lombard kingdom. The Beneventans, in spite sort of more far away from Pavia, actually were much more in line with royal politics. It's a complete myth that the Longobards had anarchic dukes throughout their history. That the whole system was pretty functional in many ways, especially for early medieval times. But at this point, these areas had, through paradoxically that same injection of Carolingian elite, say, repartition, like of the assets, and so the empowering of the local governors had began to sort of escape a bit, or tried to escape the royal authority. That's why they had been recalled to order. Louis II committed himself to affirm the public powers in the territorial control. He tried to contain the prevarication of the great landowners towards the small peasants. This was possible in Italy because wealth was very evenly spread, right? In Gaul, all the wealth was virtually in the hands of very few people. So this could have never been done. In Eastern France, as we've seen, the more the system grows, and the more that is the trend. In Italy, the Frankish conquest had brought to actually the impoverishment of the small landowners, but it had still, let's say, the country had still remained the more evenly balanced of all, like in the world, arguably. I don't know any other place where people were, first of all, so per capita rich, and second, like maintaining this over the ages, right? So while of course this was, like, in relative terms true, because still this was an unequal society, like the aristocracy ruled and the peasants were down, but compared to the other kingdoms, like this was the only place where such policy could be carried out, instead of trying to privatize most, because the Franks had inherited a pretty functional public administration from the Longobards. So this was a very tidy kingdom, ruling from the cities, having this contained private clienteles that wouldn't threaten royal authority. The Franks, in order to control this foreign land after the conquest, had altered the system, but there was still something, especially from someone that was ruling from Italy, like Louis II, to maintain that as a Longobard ruler, like he technically was institutionally. Louis also interfered in the papal elections in the attempt to avail himself in his government activity of the same papal authority. But he wouldn't oppose himself, for example, to the initiatives of Pope Nicholas II, that in the 60s of the 9th century, with like very wide-ranging intervention, starting from the one pertaining to the role of the bishops, affirmed his role of the higher arbiter of Christianity. This is interesting because, again, it shows how the popes were about these ideas from way before the Gregorian reforms. Again, Rome had always this sort of awareness about the spiritual primacy and universal mandate of its role. The Carolingian emperor here couldn't do too much. Like, it was content with this force operating like within the system, of course, like being one with the royal rule. There was an attempt again to maintain the kingdom state, right? Little success, say a modest one, was gained in Louis II's effort to stem, especially in the south, the growing threat represented by the Saracens, right, that were expanding in the Mediterranean, aggressing with repeated incursions the peninsular coastline. Right. This was difficult, especially because Italy has such multiple tens of kilometers of coastline, and the Carolingians were primarily a terrestrial power. Fleets were not really their thing. There was some naval potential in Italy, but it was mostly concentrated in the south, where there were still like these Byzantine realities. The Saracens were not really this. Yes, there was the time in which they managed to sack the same St. Peter and St. Paul. This was seen as a enormous tragedy, of course, but overall, from a territorial point of view, they weren't so threatening at all. Right, the Saracens were mostly pirates. They made incursions. They at best created, like the Vikings, like fortified entrenchments, but they didn't settle. They didn't have, like from North Africa, even the demographic strength to alter, like the northern Mediterranean shores were overwhelmingly more populated, differently from the Vikings in northern Europe, that instead, like being quite depopulated, sort of managed to alter the ethnos. Probably the genetic landscape. There was rather like an incredibly complex interplay that we will see better in video about Louis II's reign only, having to do, for example, importantly with the Duchy of Benevent, for example, that was, as we mentioned before, part of the Longobard kingdom, and consequently should have been part of the same Carolingian kingdom of Italy, but that had remained de facto semi-independent reality, sort of proxy state between the Franks and the Byzantines. At some point, the Franks had marched on Benevent. They had managed to impose their own duke, but then, that something you could do just every once in a while. These guys would re-elect their own, and things would continue like that. The Duchy of Benevent didn't have like a threatening capacity, territorially speaking, but it could be infiltrated by the Byzantines primarily, that were always trying to erode Carolingian power, especially at this point of its weakness. Especially they were so triggered by the fact that they had lost Rome historically, like this is true since quite some time, like from the time the first Carolingians had to do with Italy in the first place, in the more than 1 century before. It's also unfair to think that Benevent was something like the last bulwark against the Arab expansion. Again, if anything, it was the Longobards of Benevent that hired the Saracens as mercenaries and used them, and that's why they were roaming around. But these were mostly limited to the coastlands. Right before we saw there were even the emirates of Bari and Taranto, but these were just sort of ports, right? The Saracens controlled the Calabrian coastland. They had Sicily, and they even established a base on the mouth of the Garigliano River close to Rome. They launched raids into Sabina, like in Provence. They had the bases of Fraxinetum that they used to devastate from places like in southern France, but also the upper Rhineland, right across the Alps, and also in Piedmont. But again, especially central northern Italy weren't that skated by Saracen incursions in the longer run. The Magyars did a lot of damage, but that started happening a bit later from this time. With time, actually, the Saint Duchy of Benevent sort of fragmented. There were other entities within it, such as Salerno and Capua, that began to contend like the ducal primacy to the Beneventans. This, as you know, would remain Longobards lords until and within the Norman realm much later, always playing this sort of ambiguous role in southern Italy. They were very, very flirtatious again with both the Byzantines and the Franks for their own gains, right? Actually, some Longobard lords wouldn't hesitate to even keep briefly the Saint Louis II Emperor imprisoned, right? Which is insane, but yes, it did happen. We will see it at some point better. When Louis II died, 875, he was without sons, right? So the Kingdom of Italy, together with the imperial title, bear in mind, that was never to be detached from in the Middle Ages, passed to the uncle Charles the Bald, that will hold it for a couple of years, and this he wouldn't live that longer after this. Like, he had outlived everyone basically in the end, and because of the aforementioned story, yes, he managed to arrive in Italy to have himself crowned, but not to control it. Right, he had to come back to France because the Germans were de facto like threatening like an enormous mess if he had tried to maintain the control of the peninsula as well. Again, lots of different things happened. There are the local marquisans and dukes, and just like in the other kingdoms. But speaking, in fact, of the Western Frankish kingdom and Charles the Bald as the ruler of, in fact, the Francia Occidentalis, we can spot in him, like, even in the gravity of the situation and because of the internal threats, together with the perils that came from the outside, it shows the greater, say, cultural openings in some sense. There is no doubt that France was sort of the country that was historically more attached with the Frankish grandeur, like the Carolingian Empire, the Merovingian legacy, and again, the true center of the Frankish power had been for centuries northeastern France. There's no doubt about this, right? And this is how it would remain historically. The St. Charles had an excellent education, which you want to appreciate for a Frankish ruler. He welcomed in his court, which was itinerating, like pretty much like the one of all these sovereigns, even though there were already some more important settlements. I mean, Paris was then important, yes, but there wasn't quite the concept of capital because, as we've seen, the Carolingian rulers were used to roam around. And technically, it had been Aachen, north of the Alps, and the only, like, let's not digress. We talk about Regensburg, the other was Pavia. These were the most important cities, right? But France, since it was so big and so powerful in terms of literal wealth, like, could allow the same king to itinerate more frequently. So this court had, however, the best scholars and thinkers of the time, right? There was a great emphasis, of course, of these men, mostly trained, educated in the episcopal and monastic schools, with the Carolingian Renaissance. This was true also as far as the relation with the popes was concerned. I mean, again, in all this Carolingian epopee, we don't have to forget that the connections between the Franks and Rome were old as Clovis, right? That there was a strong connection, ecclesiastically speaking, between, say, the Frankish church, probably one of the Frankish kingdom of Neustria in this case, and Milan and Ravenna and Rome. Charles the Bald is particularly connected with Hadrian II. This we have seen again that video about Charles III as well. Like, there was always like a Western Frankish and Eastern Frankish part in Rome that had historically also had an Anglo-Saxon community, a Byzantine community, like a Longobard one, of course. You named them, and was unavoidably remaining connected with all these greater centers. And now the papacy itself had seen itself mostly within the Western sphere, even though they thought they were controlling spiritually both the, say, mostly the West. They understood that. I mean, but the option was to still make leverage on Constantinople. It was a bit of a different thing and sort of very different from Western spirituality already at that point. There were lots of issues with the kingdom that Charles tried to fix. Think about the capitulary of Quercy. There were like many attempts to try properly to stem, especially the fragmentation of the various fiefs, but the inheritance was somehow forced. Like, it wasn't even an invasion or anything. Like, simply the sovereign began to lose grip on the rest of his immense territory, which should be said, but that up to that point had been controlled fairly easily by the Carolingians. The episcopate supported Charles. The same goes for his brothers, like Lothar and Louis the German had also been backed by the church solidly. The work of Charles the Bald did not prevent, however, the larger estates owners who autonomized themselves, as just said. Quercy in 877 was issued as a capitulary in the expectation of the military expedition into Italy, the one that would make Charles emperor, right? As Charles II. His mother would have been proud to know. And that recognized and attempted to discipline that process of patrimonialization of the smaller fiefs, right? That's how it began. It began from the smaller ones, because the other one, is the Italic capitulary of Conrad II in 1037 that pertained to the inheritance of the larger fiefs, right? And there was a reason for that at the time. This one here was to essentially co-opt the smaller aristocracy to contain the abuse of the most powerful fiefs older that were not meant to actually consider them as inheritable. Technically, nobody in the Romano-Germanic tradition could hope in a purely juridical sense to inherit anything, because everything literally belonged to the kings. Ideally, of course, they wished they had, but I mean, always, like, this had been very much the way. Like in Roman times, there was a demand, and when peoples like the Franks, and in the case of Clovis, like, marched in and seized power, they said, okay, what was all this public authority now is my personal possession. And so literally everything that existed everywhere belonged exclusively and fully to the king. This could go very fast metaphysically, like in the control of everybody, telling the truth. But again, such power is not of this earth, right? The Quercy Capitulary was issued just for also levy this army, as we've seen, for the Roman expedition, but it was meant to be provisional. I need your help, I will grant you this, but now it's just una tantum, like you don't get this repeated for the generation. Instead, that's what de facto it would happen. Charles the Bald died in the same 877. Right in time, you can argue. And after his death, the councils, the assemblies that had traditionally regulated the kingdom sort of decayed. These were historically like the assemblies of all of the army, first of all, so of the nobility, mostly in France, right? In theory, the assembly of all the freemen in arms, but in France from quite a long time, like just the ultra elite that controlled the entire system, most of these fierce mounted heretians of the major lords, like already heavily clad and sort of pretty powerful in open field as a shock force. These assemblies were substituted by other types of association that were smaller, more local, more pragmatic, that began to operate already under his son, Charles' son, Louis the Bulbous. The second great wave of peoples in the early Middle Ages, like, it's very different from the migration era, except a bit for the Magyars, that, yes, were this, not even a steppe people historically, but, they had turned into such, they replaced the Avar Khaganate, and they managed to crush the Eastern Franks in that frontier that at some point was lost for hundreds of kilometers, as deep as Vienna, for example. This compromised literally like the possibility of a further stabilization. We didn't talk so much about the Vikings on Schwerpunkt, but there is a paradox in the Western Frankish kingdom. It's the one that fragments factually the fastest of all of these. The reason being that the local elites were so powerful and many, that they could split the system, except this was so resourceful that it sort of kept paradoxically together at a lower level as a glue. At the beginning, again, it made everything more prorompently tragic, because these elites had the capacity, in fact, to say nuts to the king. And great part of the Viking success, there were also Magyar and Saracen invasions in Gaul, but mostly the Normans carried it out, were due to the same Carolingian nobility, the post-Carolingian one, because they literally invited them to disgregate further royal power. Paradoxically, this helped some royal power to remain spiritually functional, because these smaller the smaller aristocracy, as we were saying before, actually remained a bit more faithful in the kings. They said, look, there are these other thugs that are abusing us. Like, if we give power to you, you will help us also against the second invaders that are being often sponsored by these guys that trade with them, that send them to loot in the neighboring lands to eventually profit from that. So that there are lots of pretty serious things happening, going on in that circumstance. We've seen it well in the video about the Duchy of Aquitaine, where, like, in order not to reaccept a royal rule, there are some dukes that literally call the Vikings in, and it's a freaking mess, to say the least. So that is not to say that the second invaders would have had much of a shot if the system was united. Actually, even the royal, let's say, policy against the Viking raids was quite effective. Like the Vikings at some point are stopped with things like fortified bridges. There are lots of serious things happening, including the siege of Paris, etc. But it doesn't last too long. At some point, they realize that France is too much of a tough nut to crack, and they mostly say favor the harassment of England, right? On the other hand, again, yes, this does not help like the broader unity. Many counties say, okay, we're on our own, right? We have to protect ourselves with our own militias. We have to also at some point gather different counties under a single ruler. And there was a very thick process of encastellation, often in a way that was separated from the one of the sovereign. Actually, this was not the single fastest moment of encastellation historically. This happened in the 10th century, and it depends also where, because actually this, especially in the north, happened more rarely. In part also because the clienteles were strong enough to oppose a military resistance on their own in the Frankish heartland. In part because these were even a bit more primitive areas. So the encastellation starts from the south and the north, but it mostly happens at the end of the great raids and invasions. Nevertheless, the type of encastellation that happens at this point is a big deal, because traditionally the right to fortify an area, and so to exercise eventually from it, because that was the ultimate goal, not much defending from the outside, but extending the control locally, was a public prerogative. Nobody could create a banal lordship, coercing the local population just on their own. At least they require, even if this happened to some extent as we've seen, in a consensual way, which is often an underrated aspect of the story, because these people needed protection somehow, so it was better to be under a powerful guy than nobody, right? The contempt towards, by the way, the Franks were quite sensitive to this. A king that could not protect the subjects, this is a huge deal, right? So it really equated ideologically to an emasculation of the king. Like, if you're not capable of protecting your subjects, you're a weak one. Like, you're not even a man. Like, God despises you. Like, it comes all with lack of imperium, of grace, and so on, right? So it's at this point that France witnesses the affirmation of allodial properties that historically would be quite difficultly sort of dislodged, I'd say at least incorporated by the crown later on. So the allodia, in this case without delegation even, properties that could not be touched even by the king, and that would in fact politically be off limits for a very long time, given the royal weakness. this event, we will see it a bit more in depth, is very well exemplified by the case of Robert the Strong, that would, as essentially the founder of what would become the Capetian dynasty, build an hegemonic area around Paris, so much so that the Robertians would become, as you know, the Counts of Paris, and setting again paving the way to the future royal dynasty of the Capetians. That naturally had not been born overnight, right? Paris, again, was a very, very important city since late Roman times. It had always had a royal residence from the Merovingians, so it was kind of obvious. But just for saying that some important dynasties were being born today, just like the Ottonians somewhere in Saxony were emerging, right, as like gradually. Think about this, that Henry the Fowler had been born when the Carolingian Empire still existed. That's mind-blowing if you think about that. And you always have a connection with the Carolingians. I mean, it was unlikely for these powers to have emerged from nothing. Unfortunately, the genealogies are not so certain in many cases, but we see that all the very important high medieval dynasties had been born from some connection with the, if not a blood one, but still like politically with the Carolingians. And they were already very powerful. They already took part in that grandeur, splendor, wealth, especially again the Western Frankish kingdom, as far as the elites were concerned, had the most powerful ones, right, in absolute terms. So in the years of Charles the Bald, you have the empirical solutions to the problems of power organization and local defense. You find many, for example, bishops that become, in the absence of comital power, sometimes that bailed out, pursuing some sort of more lay investment in the countryside. This is especially frequent in France and Germany, but actually everywhere. But there it functioned more, where you have some wards that are, some fiefs that are expanding very far and wide in the open ground. But the cities are controlled by the bishops. They have to man the walls, they have to repair them in case of attack. They are becoming true lords on their own, right? And this would anticipate what essentially would be happening everywhere in the following decades, right? Considering the East again, the Magyars, also the Bulgars actually were still active in some way, but everything was particularly turbulent. All these countries were exposed to some frontiers, especially the Eastern Frankish kingdom that didn't really have an eastern border neatly outlined, and it had sort of less civilized peoples like knocking at the door. Again, Gaul, Italy were actually more sheltered. Gaul was more exposed because it was so big and with all these rivers, and so it was easy for the Vikings to launch raids and this incredibly rich, fat place on the Atlantic plains, populated, agriculturally productive, and so on. But again, there wasn't much they could do to disgregate the political entity right there, nor this could be possible in Italy. In the eastern half of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, there was a concrete risk of this thing sort of being destabilized. I mean, Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria at some point did risk under the Magyars and the Slavs to give way in terms of political organization. This is serious. Like, it's just like, I don't know, when Hamburg was founded and the Vikings destroyed it, and then it was rebuilt, but this was the least developed of the post-Carolingian world, and so the local institutions were more unstable, and they would in fact evolve in some historically particular direction, including the imperial one itself, because the Eastern Franks sort of were obliged to be militarized to cope with these external threats. Also, the elective monarchy, after all, that wouldn't give these guys enough power, but they want to go make expeditions abroad rather than consolidating a national monarchy at home. So the imperial crown will pass to two children of Louis the German, Charlemagne and Charles the Fat. The latter, it happens, like with everybody dies. This does happen in Frankish history. And so one guy manages to get things together. Think about Dagobert. Think about like this, even the same Charlemagne or Louis the Pious that had scored big time. That Charles is not, he's not even such a bad king. Like, he is criticized because he pays off the Vikings to go away from Paris. He was apparently obese, and so he didn't shine because of in front of the ideal of the hyper supremacistic sort of Frankish ruler that has to slaughter, excessive loads of people to banquet on their corpses and prove that he's so cocky and strong and whatever, and solving all the problems with his sword in many ways. But after all, like, he did his possible, and he sort of gathered all this political inheritance of the Carolingians after the death of his brother, Charlemagne, and the absence, now the extinction of the other branches of other competitors. In 882, he was crowned emperor by Pope John VIII. Quite a character, by the way. The guy that people say it was a woman, that's not true at all. But there's all a history behind that is extremely fascinating. This was naturally a very ephemeral recovery. The Eastern Frankish aristocracy pushed in, especially for his abdication, and it obtained it in 887. Basically, if I'm not wrong, like, this guy was like obese in his bed, and since he was the emperor, like, all the retinues of the empire like was waiting for his orders. And when news arrived that Arnulf of Carinthia had proclaimed himself emperor, everybody fled the court. And the fat Charles remained in the bed, being fed apparently by the Bishop of Mainz, which sort of remained there and take care of him. Like, it may seem like a joke, but these things did really happen. These Frankish people, like, fanatically infatuated with the idea of the empire that had spread its wings further east, and leaving the guy. Like, it's pretty sad, actually, but it sort of speaks of what this world had been, and how gigantic the endeavor of the Carolingians had been, and equally how big the crash would be to another extent. Charles died in 888, and it's an easy date to remember. This ends de facto like the imperial adventure of the Carolingians. After this date, there were, in fact, other emperors that, however, basically had nothing of the ambitions of the former ones, nor the capacity of restoring a universal empire. Until Otto I, really, you don't have anything of that kind. And even that, it's another story, as you know. The ones that had it easier because they were the closest to Rome, and so they could be elected emperors with less effort, were the Italic rulers. For example, you have this thunder-like, this blitz-like career of Guy, the Marquis of Spoleto. We discussed this figure in the video about the duchy. In 889 he was elected king of Italy by the local nobility, and in 899 he was crowned emperor. But he wouldn't found really a royal dynasty, because technically he controlled just Spoleto. That's an interesting stuff. But basically have Friuli, Ivrea, a bit of the Mark of Tuscany, and it's pretty much it. Like, you have the papacy, the Rome also as the lay nobility of the city there, and you have these interferences. Spoleto is just across the Apennine, can infiltrate and easily towards Rome. Interestingly, the Spoletan Longobards had been the first guys to give themselves to papal authority when Pippin the Short had marched into Italy, right? Rather than being directly conquered by the Franks. It's sort of ironic that at the end of the day they would have become literal emperors, controlling Rome, and partially, of course. Nobody really ever controlled Rome, if you think about that. And so on. And then, of course, there is so 10th century, but that's not what we're talking about. We're far exceeding today's topic. But I think it's important to discuss this, isn't it? Like, having like a broader view of this period, like the dynamics behind the disgregation, because otherwise it's just remembering the dates and names, which is mandatory always. Like, don't think that those things are not important, because where do you hinge your knowledge otherwise? Politics, territory, you must know geography, otherwise you go nowhere. But really understanding what animated these people, what sort of their ambitions were, why things began to fall apart, in which relation these events were also in connection with the second invaders, that's sort of relevant. And each one of these territories has an enormous history that, even just during the Carolingian Empire, deserves to be really investigated very much in depth. Alright, so we will keep looking at this stuff. I'm sure that we will be enjoying other videos about the Carolingians that are starting to become really powerful, and so that's a relevant aspect. I'm just watching, by the way, if you wonder what I'm doing, I'm just watching the Ukrainian bombings in Crimea that are taking place right now. So, yeah, always kind of a spectacle every once in a while. Alright, so for today I stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.